onto the sulfur cycle. So as with the other cycles, we talk about the forms, the pools, and then we start talking about transformations or fluxes between those pools. And as I said, it's a more complex cycle because the sulfur molecule can take several oxidation reduction states, so it can be involved in more chemical forms. These include sulfide. Sulfide is a toxic molecule when it's in the form of hydrogen sulfide, the gas. It is also the byproduct of some fermentation, so we can sense sulfide at very low concentrations. As with the question on ammonium, sulfide is a good indicator of rotting proteins, and so humans are very sensitive to that particular odor. It's about one of the, we're more sensitive to that than almost any other odor. And then we're working from reduced to oxidized along this list. And the next step is elemental sulfur. Some of you may have seen that yellowish or sometimes whitish looking element, solid. Then thiosulfate, S2O3, 2 minus. Sulfate, SO4, 2 minus. The organic sulfur, what molecules is sulfur a part of? Organic molecules is sulfur a part of in our body? Anybody know? Well, I already said breaking down proteins, right? So you could have got that one. It's an important side group in amino acids, and it's used to cross-link proteins. We'll talk about that cross-linking because it's important in stabilizing proteins against high temperatures. Dimethyl sulfide is a gas which is produced and quite important in the global sulfur cycle. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's another organic molecule. It's just two methyl groups stuck onto a sulfide, basically. And we can talk about some of the different transformations. So one of the things that happens if you have sulfide in solution in contact with oxygen is that it will be oxidized by the oxygen even if the solution is completely sterile. And what I'm saying is there's enough potential energy at room temperature to drive that reaction at low rates from sulfide to sulfate. But it is also a situation where sulfide has potential energy when oxygen's around, right? And so organisms have evolved the capacity to harvest that energy chemoautotrophically in a function, in a manner very similar to ammonium oxidation or nitrification. But they really have to be in the right place at the right time, because if they don't get that sulfide quickly, it's going to spontaneously convert to sulfate eventually. This is the same reason why when we have combustion of sulfur from coal, it comes out of the smokestack oftentimes as sulfide, but it will actually convert to sulfate in the atmosphere and create sulfuric acid, which then falls on the land and causes in the lakes and causes problems. So you can have biotic organism-mediated or abiotic conversion all the way through this series of steps from sulfide to elemental sulfur to thiosulfate to sulfate. If you look in the book, there's a huge list of the different things that organisms can do with sulfur, and I'll whittle down that list a little bit. I'm giving you the simpler version of this. So just like nitrate can be used to accept electrons when organisms are oxidizing organic carbon, so can sulfate. It turns out that sulfate is a little less oxidized than nitrate, which is less oxidized than oxygen. So the energy yield using sulfate to oxidize organic carbon is less than the other two processes. So if you have oxygen, nitrate, and sulfate in solution, dump in organic carbon in the right bacteria, the oxygen will get used first, nitrogen will get used second, sulfate will get used third, because that's how you can get the most energy out of it. Disproportionation, and I leave this one in here because this is one that's actually been relatively recently discovered. Certainly since I started teaching this class, it wasn't here at the beginning of the class for me. And the idea here is that this thiosulfate actually has sulfurs that are at two different oxidation reduction potentials in the same molecule. And so if an organism can break down when there's not oxygen around, it can use the oxidized part to create sulfides and sulfate and generate energy. So it can basically react the molecule with itself to extract energy. It's a pretty cool adaptation, actually. And this one's extraordinarily important for a number of reasons. And that is sulfate will precipitate with metallic compounds and form relatively insoluble precipitates that will crystallize. The most common form of that you are probably aware of is iron and sulfur bonded together, known as iron pyrite. And does anybody know the common name for iron pyrite?
Fool's gold.
Yeah, fool's gold. Fool's gold is the most common one, and that's really important because we'll see that links the sulfur cycle to the phosphorus cycle through iron. And it actually has a key role in what happens when we add excess of phosphorus to lakes, and the ability of those lakes to absorb that phosphorus and deposit it and keep it in their sediments, as opposed to recycling it continuously and causing this big state change. So this is going to pop up again. It's quite important. I mentioned to you that there's a process, when I drew over the carbon cycle, I said there's a process where carbon dioxide can be fixed to organic carbon in the absence of oxygen. And this is anoxygenic photosynthesis. And it's a process that's analogous to oxygenic photosynthesis, splitting water to free electrons to allow carbon dioxide to be converted to organic carbon, right? That's the standard oxygenic photosynthesis. But there's an alternative form of photosynthesis where you can take sulfide as an electron donor, give off sulfate, and pull carbon dioxide into organic carbon. This anoxygenic photosynthesis is likely the earliest form of photosynthesis. It probably evolved before oxygenic photosynthesis did, which then allowed the cyanobacteria to take over the world and oxygenate it and become the dominant organisms that they have been since that 2.5 billion years ago when they took control. So there's two organisms that have been able to do that and dominate the world. One group is the cyanobacteria, and the other one that has dominated global biogeochemistry is people. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so again, we're going to go through that same process that we just went through. It'll be okay. You'll practice these three cycles a number of times, and you'll have it. Okay, so we have plus oxygen, minus oxygen. What was the most reduced inorganic form of sulfur of the ones that I listed?
Sulfide.
Sulfide, right? So we've got sulfide. Then the next one is elemental sulfur. And then we have thiosulfate, right? And sulfate. fairly easy when you look at these different cycles. The oxidized form in the carbon cycle is CO2, and it has more oxygens physically on the molecule than methane does. Nitrate has more oxygens than nitrite, which has more oxygens than ammonium, right? Sulfate has more oxygens per sulfur than thiosulfate does, and then these two you're just gonna have to remember between the two. But this one has the 2 electrons as opposed to this one not having the 2 free electrons, so it falls towards the negative redox. And then we have organic sulfur and DMS, dimethyl sulfide. Dimethyl sulfide is a gas, and that's why it's important in the global sulfur cycle. So I talked about this, but basically dimethyl sulfide is generated as a byproduct of a chemical protection that phytoplankton have against being grazed. When the cells are broken by grazers, they will generate a toxic acrylate, and the byproduct of it is dimethyl sulfide. What it means though is there's a gaseous form of sulfur that can go out of the environment and then be in the world. This turns out to be quite important because it's related in nucleating formation of clouds. So it actually has an effect on global weather. Okay, so we talked about a number of different things. The one thing that we haven't also talked about yet, but is important and analogous to the nitrogen cycle, is that sulfide is the form of sulfur that has to be assimilated, as opposed to these other forms. It's probably not an accident that the most reduced inorganic form is the preferred form, because organisms evolved on Earth under reducing conditions, and so the oxidized forms were probably fairly rare. That's probably why the biochemical pathways evolved to use that reduced form, because that's what was the most available at the time when life evolved. So we have this assimilation, and essentially, even if a bacterium or a phytoplankton uses sulfate, it's got to convert it all the way to sulfide before it gets in. Okay, so if I take this sulfide and turn it to sulfate in the presence of oxygen, is that going with or against potential energy? With potential energy, right? So this is an oxidation of sulfide, right? And I've mentioned that it can happen both biotic and abiotically. Biotic or biotic oxidation. So one of the things is that if you can read my handwriting, you might pass the class, but it's going to take a long time to get to that point. So we have this abiotic and biotic oxidation. It turns out that eventually this stuff turns into sulfate and feeds into this process. One of the tricks to writing these cycles is that you should never have a pool that doesn't have arrows coming in and out of it. So if there's something that you've written them all down and they're like, wait, there's no arrow, there's only an arrow coming in and not one going out, there's something wrong. And another way to think about that is that if that flux was missing, like if the flux from organic gas was missing altogether, was missing, then all of the sulfur in the world would be tied up in organic sulfur. Right? Organisms have evolved an ability to essentially use compounds when they're in high concentrations in the environment, because if they build up, then they have potential energy, and then there's an opportunity to use them up. Okay, so we have biotic and abiotic oxidations, and remember, this happens slowly abiotically, quickly biotically. So what you expect to see this in the environment is where there's steep gradients of redox and oxygen. Places where sulfide can diffuse in and oxygen can be diffused into that same spot. So we have these biogeochemical hot spots, and we'll talk about that again. It will come up pretty soon. We also then can take sulfate to sulfide, and that's that's essentially a dissimilatory reduction. And this is, this biological reduction occurs when we're oxidizing what compound? So this is, that is the sulfur compounds are serving as an electron acceptor to oxidize what compound? As they are in denitrification and respiration, as oxygen does for respiration and nitrate does for denitrification. What's, got the wrong carbon form. What are we oxidizing? So it's analogous to respiration, so what are you oxidizing with respiration?
Carbon, organic carbon.
Organic carbon, right? So using oxidized compounds, combining them with that reduced organic carbon to yield energy in a process that's analogous to respiration. Okay, so there's also, we also had this cool energy yielding pathway. Disproportionation. Taking one of the sulfurs, turning into and the oxygen turning into sulfate, the other turning into sulfide in the absence of oxygen, and generating energy for chemoautotrophic growth. And there's one more flux, I think that's it. Oh, two more fluxes, three more fluxes, sorry. Yeah, disproportionation. So there's the heterotropic recycling, like we have to do to get our amino acids with sulfur in them. We had the metal pyrite, we'll just write it as F, iron, sulfur, sulfide. So if there's iron around, anoxically, it will precipitate, make an insoluble precipitate with sulfur. And the very last one is here, it's taking sulfide and going to sulfate. Anoxically, is that going with or against potential energy?
Against.
It's going against potential energy. So I already mentioned this flux. Any guesses as to what it is? Anoxygenic
Photosynthesis.
photosynthesis, right? So light's coming in from outside and driving this. Photosynthesis. So it's actually able to drive the sulfur, the sulfate, to an oxidized form. This is why some people think that the oldest set of biogeochemical fluxes are built on the sulfur cycle. Because in the early earth there was no oxidized, right? But you could be generating sulfate through anoxygenic photosynthesis, so you could have all these other fluxes happening and create a full sulfur cycle.